So yeah, in this final session, we're going to be discussing a pretty hot topic, sustainable financing, and especially how we are charging, or rather supercharging, the Singapore Green FinTech ecosystem. It's my privilege to welcome on stage our esteemed panelists, starting with Benjamin So, Managing Director of Stacks, a Singapore FinTech company focused on ESG FinTech. They're working in partnership with the Monetary Authority of Singapore on the Greenprint project for the Greenprint ESG registry. Ben is a serial fintech entrepreneur who previously founded a B2B fintech firm with more than 500 employees in 6 countries, which is quite impressive. Congratulations, Ben. Next in line is David Ko, Managing Director and Deputy Head of Corporate Banking Asia Pacific of SMBC. David is responsible for supporting the strengthening and execution of the One SMBC Corporate Coverage and Solutions platform strategy for the region, and he brings close through 30 years of deep international experience in corporate and transaction banking, having worked across 7 different geographies. Not impressive as well. So next in line is Jonas Turek, Head of F10 Singapore, which is the Asia Launchpad for F10 Global, which is a leading incubator and accelerator for FinTech and Web3 startups. Before joining F10, Jonas worked at the Embassy of Switzerland in China as the Deputy Head of Science, Technology, Education and Innovation section. Thank you, Jonas. And last in the lineup, we have Professor Johan Suleiman, Director of NUS Sustainability and Green Finance Institute, who is also the Dean's Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Finance at the NUS Business School. And he also recently served as the founding Academic Director of the NUS Master of Finance program. So over now to our moderator, who will kickstart the session.
Thank you for the introduction. I would like to go ahead and get started as soon as possible. I can see the clock ticking, and we have a very interesting panel today, and I'm very excited to hear more from these industry experts about what's going on in green fintech in Singapore. Now, of course, Singapore is a major financial hub, and there's a lot of activities in Singapore in many different sectors in finance. But one thing that is quite intriguing is this confluence of sustainability aspect of finance and fintech. And Singapore would like to be the leader in both, but at the same time, I think we need more understanding about what is actually green fintech. And maybe we can start with each one of you describing to us what you think is green fintech and how each of you have contributed to the ecosystem here in Singapore. Maybe we'll start with Ben, please.
Thanks, Prof. And thank you everyone for being here. I know it's Friday afternoon, so thanks for your time. So my name is Ben. I'm the founder and managing director of Stacks. And to Johan, your question, right? Okay, so I think green fintech means that it is actually the bridge between green tech and financial services, because fintech has been around for a while now, right? And in the last few years, there have been many very efficient technologies in green tech. Okay, but they need a bridge between themselves and the financial services, because after all, the world is going to need a lot more capital, okay, to be able to finance these projects. I just read a news article today on the Straits Times actually, where it talks about the IMF releasing a study that says that the world needs $35 trillion worth of investments in the energy space in order to be more sustainable. So that's an example of how, okay, the money needs to come from the private sector, and green fintech is the way to be able to enable it. So Stacks, our company, is actually a enterprise B2B fintech company. Okay, we were founded 3 years ago in the purpose of providing digitalization to the financial sector. And we realized that the financial industry has a common need, which is to use these technologies to enable better green financing. So we've been very lucky to be able to partner with the industry like the banks and accelerators and the industry in general, and also partner with MAS in Project Greenprint, aimed at providing this bridge between the real world and the financial ecosystem. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Well, on behalf of SMBC, first and foremost, thank you for having us here. And thank you again for sharing your time with us here today. I think from a bank's perspective, as Ben's already mentioned, Project Greenprint, that's been sponsored by MAS. That's actually for us been a watershed moment for us and our engagement here within the local community, financial community, and then be able to reach out to a wider group of people to engage, right? Because I always say banking cannot operate in a vacuum. We need people, we need companies, we need community, right? And how do we then bring capital into this? And if ESG and all things, especially around combating climate change, has become such an urgent matter, then how do we employ the latest technologies to make this possible? I think, as Ben already pointed out, the amount of capital required. I think for us as an industry and our engagement at this time in multiple projects, one of the things that I think is most urgent, if you will, on our part is to combat greenwashing. I think there's an element where the financial community with our customers have come to a point where you see the amount of green bonds issued, you can see the amount of green financing through green loans, but how do we make sure that we're truly bringing impact? And that's where we hope to be able to deploy and partner with FinTech companies. Because again, if you've seen the last few weeks, what's happened in New York and what's happened in Frankfurt, I think it's very urgent. If we've got the right tech, then some of these things we're starting to see shouldn't have been even possible, right? We would have done the right things the right way and represented things the right, for the right outcomes, I should say. So, thank you.
Thanks. Jonas, please.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you so much for being here today. I'm Jonas, I'm representing F10. We are really, on the one hand, helping startups to grow and really a startup school on the one hand with an incubator, and on the other hand, we are working with financial institutions, which David represents, matching them with up-and-coming startups. And for us, actually, climate fintech is quite a big topic. Yesterday, on Wednesday, actually, we presented at the Stockholm Plus 50 conference a climate fintech report, which will be coming out very soon. And in there, we basically define green finance more from the climate fintech perspective. And climate fintech for us is really digital financial technology that advances or enables decarbonization. So we really look at it from this angle, and I think the use cases are still quite diverse. So really from carbon footprinting of payment transactions to ESG rating of companies and funds, transition risk assessments of stranded assets according to environmental criteria. And of course, I think Web3 is also the new angle that goes into climate fintech as well. Just mentioning, for example, carbon exchanges. For us, it's a big opportunity as well. We have seen doubling of the venture funds going into the space. So I think it's also a very big opportunity in terms of startups coming in and really growing. And that's a space where we are in as well.
Thank you. I think one of the main threat here that I see is that there are a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of opportunities. Right? There's a lot of opportunities in this space. I think Singapore has done quite well in terms of pushing the agenda, but I'm trying to understand a bit better, maybe for the audience as well. What do you think is driving sort of the buzz here in Singapore for this issue of sustainability? Now I understand that the climate threat, and we are worried about Singapore being underwater. So we are all worried about this at some personal level. But I think there's more issue at stake here. So I was wondering what do you think is driving the buzz in terms of sustainability and in terms of combining it with the financial technology, or going back to what Ben was saying, green tech, right? How do we finance these potentially radical ideas to improve our environment? Maybe Jonas, you want to start first?
Yeah, sure. And I took some notes. I'm impressed that you don't need that. Friday afternoon, I need some notes. but I think definitely it's a macro factors, of course. We see here the government is really pushing a topic. There is, for example, like the project Greenprint, right? There is also the Accelerator, which just came out with, I think, 57 challenges, problem statements that companies can address. So I think it's really impressive how much MAS is doing and the government here. So it's definitely a push. On the other hand, I would also say the awareness has really risen, right? I almost feel like, I'm only here for 2.5 years, but I feel like the topic has picked up a lot also among citizens, right? So I think the awareness has grown. There have been enough climate disasters in the recent years. So it's also a pull from customers that really want to have exposure to environmentally friendly products. I think David can probably allude more to that as well. And of course, for us again, I think there are now specific climate fintech focused venture funds, such as Tembusu, for example. Tembusu partner that launched Sustainable Future Fund. So all of that, I think, is really driving that in Singapore.
Thank you. So I'm trying to, from David, I would like to hear more about what do you see the demand is? Is there a lot of demand as well? Because I understand there's a lot of push from the government. So I'm trying to understand from your bank perspective, right? Do you see demand for this type of technology, this type of innovation, both from the corporate side as well as maybe internally from your own institution?
No, that's a really good question. I guess the demand, because when we are engaging through the fintechs right now and things that we have started to sponsor as SMBC, these are new technologies. So there's an element of how we're going to prove up that the technology can work and will work for the adoption to take place. So I think the demand will ultimately be there. There's a latent demand to how we can do things better and more efficiently. But we got to find a way to pick the right technologies, because I suspect what we pick today will have a lasting impact, because we can't move from one standard to the next, from 1 year to the next, right? I mean, a lot of companies and countries have all made very long-term commitments between now to 2030. It seems to be a really big year for a lot of people. Then there's 2050, then there's 2060, right? And what we hope that we're supporting here, will help set the standards. We're across 3 projects right now under Greenprint. One is Project Nova. I know Ben's business is very much intimately involved in that as well. That's going to be an AI-enabled platform to see how, from one industry to the next, and we're starting with real estate, right? We can really measure, how people are deploying green financing to bring about real impact, right? And we'll hopefully take it from real estate to shipping, to manufacturing, perhaps starting with the semiconductor industry, amongst others. And we're looking at a lot of these things like food and agriculture. A lot of these things are extremely meaningful, right? And how that will feed through the remainder of the ecosystem. We talk about carbon credits. There's a lot of these things because fundamentally, and here's an open secret, right? And everybody knows this to a certain degree. All these commitments we've made, how we're going to get there, nobody knows. We're still working on it. And that's where we hope a lot of things that we do today and will invest right now to make things possible, we will find out how to get there together. Because it's pointless, especially for Singapore, right? And how open we are. I talked about the 3 projects. One that is of Singapore origin, one of American origin, and one of New Zealand origin. So and that's the open thing that's helping create the buzz as well, that we are so open. And we're looking to help. How can we use our platform as an international financial center to enable these technologies that will have a global application?
I think talking about global impact, I think is very important, particularly for these environmental issues. I think the one thing that I get from that is that we do need to build the infrastructure better, and we do need to think hard about what kind of infrastructure we're building at the moment. Now I know Ben has been busy building infrastructure, so I would like to hear about what do you see again, I'm going to go back to demand. What do you see the demand for your services that you see from Singapore as well as from outside of Singapore?
Yeah. So I think to address that, we see these things from a few different perspectives, right? So firstly, I think there's an opportunity for Singapore as a country, because Singapore is still a hub, shipping hub, aviation hub, manufacturing, process value added hub, okay, and more importantly, also a financial center, right? So, I'm very encouraged by the Singapore government's plans with the Singapore Green Plan, and this is actually, in continuation of the various digitalization strategies that Singapore have taken, right? When they said that we needed a smart financial center, now it's not just being smart, but also being green. So I think that's where we have started to see various global impact events from Singapore. I mean, our MAS chief, Ravi Menon, he's actually heading the network for greening the financial system, which is a network of all 100 over central banks in the world. Okay, and we in Singapore, okay, we have also started to help the World Bank with the Climate Warehouse Initiative. That's also been announced already. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here in Singapore to really take the lead, okay, to be a green financial center for at least the region, if not the world. Okay, and that means that the infrastructure, so to speak, needs to be able to power that, right? So I think infrastructure is both hard and soft, right? There's firstly a concerted effort by the government, okay, to build these technologies, platforms to be able to enable, this enablement of effective green finance regionally. Okay, and not just that, but on the soft side, right? There's a lot of ecosystem initiatives. So I feel very happy to be in Singapore running a startup here, frankly. I'm Singaporean, I grew up here, but frankly, my first business was in another country. So I'm a returning Singaporean, and I was very happy that there are so many different types of initiatives from the MAS, from the Enterprise Singapore, and IMDA, and of course a lot of these academic institutions, accelerators, innovation programs, all put in place for technology firms like us to really embrace and to be really able to go and try to do our best. Yeah.
So we had a sideline discussion earlier and talking about the availability of capital in Singapore particularly for this type of projects. So I was wondering, in terms of limitations, where do you see the limitations are? Because I think we talk about fundings should be available, but in terms of what are the challenges that startups in this space seem to be facing? Maybe Jonas, you can start given your specific area.
Yeah, maybe first I can give even a bit of meat to startups, climate fintech startups specifically in Singapore, because just to give a bit of an understanding and comparison to the rest of the world. So we analyzed actually that there are about 400 startups in the climate fintech space globally, and actually 85% are in Europe and the United States and other North America. So the very vast numbers of startups is actually not incorporated yet in Singapore, but we have identified about 13 climate fintechs, and I'm actually curious, we should talk about that later. But in our definition, there are about 13 climate fintech startups, so it's really early here in Singapore. I think there's a lot of potential still, but 13, 1-3. But that's obviously depends on how you define climate fintech exactly. But yeah, I mean, for us, really, the conclusion is we are very early, but we're seeing huge potential, especially in Singapore itself. We see a lot of potential in the B2B space. So there are so many international financial institutions that are looking for solutions. Hence, I would really encourage startups to come to Singapore or to start up a startup, especially in the B2B space, because you have a lot of potential customers and clients that you can work with. So I think the limitations are, I mean, the numbers are very low still, but I think up until now there were quite just a few funds that would focus on the topic. But I think now is really a change in momentum, and I think it's really happening.
Okay. So I would like to highlight that 85% number, because I think it's very surprising to see that there's not a lot of activities here, because this is the part of the world where you can actually make a lot of difference in terms of climate going forward. Right? Southeast Asia is home of a lot of forests, and these are, I think, assets in this space that can also benefit the fintech sector here in Southeast Asia. So I feel that there needs to be a lot more development in this space, particularly thinking about climate, but also thinking about other issues, right? Social issues as well. David, please.
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit blunt. I double check again. Is there media here? Sorry, had to ask. No, look, I mean, it's no big secret, but I think access to talent for a lot of fintechs will probably be been a real challenge, maybe up to about 2 years ago, would you say, Ben? I mean, I think, when you try to recruit and you're up against banks, we offer a measure of security, we offer a measure of, certainty, and if, they join you, I mean, obviously, love you to create a few more millionaires in Singapore, but, what are the chances of that, right? So, and I think people here are quite practical. I'll be honest, right? So the thing is, the war on talent, for talent, I think it's real. As you rightly pointed out, I don't think capital is an issue. So between the banks, the funds, private equity, even family offices, we're starting to see a lot of activity here, willingness of people to invest in this space. But I guess the other challenge that we've seen and something that the companies that we're sponsoring and working with, it's access to market. That even if you've got a really, really brilliant idea, and you feel that, obviously there's no doubt you'll be able to try to commercialize in Singapore, but ultimately Singapore is still a fairly small market in the grand scheme of things. How then do we, when we've created a global solution, things that we've seen perhaps are coming out of Silicon Valley or otherwise, how do we help them scale and bring their technology regionally and globally? I think that's that's where I think some degree there should be a bigger push and see how we can help people scale.
Yeah, so I think the thinking about how do you scale up, even regionally, but of course globally if possible, but even thinking about regional market, I think is very crucial in this space, right? Because we're building framework. If the framework can only be used by 5 million people here in Singapore, that's a very small market. That's 1% of the world. So I think one thing that we need to think about is when we are building this framework is how do you scale up, and even how do you scale up in ASEAN, or how do you scale up even if you're going to India or going to China, right? So I know Ben's been building frameworks. So I'm trying to figure out what do you think about the startups here in this space? Have they been working hard on trying to scale up, or have they been very focused on the Singaporean market?
I think definitely we cannot only focus on Singapore is the short answer, but there's a lot more to it, right? When you're trying to scale to Indonesia, for example, or Vietnam, for example, I do think it's important that we get the right partners involved. Right, so I think that's where the ecosystem in Singapore is very helpful, because I think in Singapore we still have a lot of different talent from different countries. And to address David's point, yes, you are absolutely right. It's always difficult, for a startup, to compete against the larger companies. And in fact, we form a breeding ground, for talents from our companies to go into the banks. Yeah. So, but more interestingly is at least, these banks are also able to give us this opportunity when they work with us, to bring us to the other regions that the banks are in. I mean, there's no bank in Singapore that's only in Singapore, frankly. Every single bank that I know in Singapore is also in many different countries. And that actually gives us a great opportunity when partnering with them to go overseas. Right? And so I think that's where it's really important for a Singaporean startup, even if it started in Singapore, to already have a global view on day one, because the Singaporean market is never going to be enough, and which is also the truth for Jonas' number. It's definitely true, because I did some research myself. So I'm also volunteering at the Singapore FinTech Association. So while we have close to 1,000 members in the SFA, the real number of green tech startups, it's definitely more than 13, because some of them do not belong in the SFA. Right, so there's this green energy efficient tech component, and there's also green fintech component. And the numbers for green fintech is very low. And there's a lot of different type of real world technologies in the different research institutes, in the different universities here. There's a lot of good technologies deployed in the farms and the aquaculture, fish farms, in Singapore, but they are not really being captured collectively. So I guess some work needs to be done here. Across agencies, across sectors, to really come up with this true green print. Right? And I think MES is really trying to do that with a marketplace of all types of solutions that will be able to bring solutions to all types of sectors.
Sorry, go ahead, Jonas.
Yeah, maybe I can just add here. So globally last year there were 40 billion invested into sustainable tech, and of that only 1.4 billion was invested into what we define as climate fintech. So it is really still a fraction of the overall sustainable tech investment.
Yeah, I think it's about how you sort of slice and dice and what you qualify, because we do see a lot of different things happening in the market, right? And the key here is ability to customize for specific industries. I think there's going to come a point where, to driving for efficiency and track and traceability, right? The ability to perhaps deploy blockchain for example, for proof of provenance, it's going to be so important, right? And so the ability to customize solutions for specific industries, something for food, right? From farmers to distributors, to airline industry, from the manufacturers of various components to the people that operate airlines. I think there's no one size that fits all. And I think when we bring more of the entire ecosystem together and understand how it is we will help, from one overlapping industry to the next, succeed, to achieve what we want to be. And that's what we're all grappling with, isn't it? I mean, the Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions measures are actually not that challenging. It's the Scope 3. One, you don't want to over-calculate it and freak everybody out, but you cannot afford to under-calculate it as well. So where do you find, just the optimal way of capturing the right data? And that's where I think FinTech can really, whether it's climate or non-climate, green or not green, these things are going to be really, really essential.
So I like the two things that you just said, which is one is the idea of thinking about it from the industry perspective, right? Instead of thinking of it as a geographic perspective, right? Because the industry perspective is something that you can scale up globally. If you know how to measure certain things, let's say in the shipping industry, that you can do it globally, right? So I think that's actually very crucial. Ben also used the words breeding ground for talent. And I think breeding ground for talent is everywhere in Singapore. It's with the startups, to some extent it's with the banks, and also, I think the Institute of Higher Learning in Singapore have been working very hard to try to develop talent in this space as well. It is very difficult actually to prepare talent for this space because you need to understand several things, right? You need to understand the technology. You also need to understand how do you measure impact, and that's actually very tricky, as I found out myself. Trying to understand, for example, if I look at David's bank, how do I measure the impact, right? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and it's beyond that, right? Because also, all the portfolio firms, they also have Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and then it becomes almost impossible to try to measure all these things. So I would like to change direction a little bit and think about going towards the future. Where do you see the trend is in Singapore? What are the interesting trend that's happening now going forward? What do you see now, and what do you see maybe 2 or 3 years down the road? Ben is thinking. How do you want to start, Ben?
Sure. So I think in the regards of green financing, to be specific, okay, I think the industry has already started to look into a more deeper dive into the entire value chain. Because at our work, right, with our work, we are trying to capture data from different sources. Of course, the reason why we do so is because the banks are instructing us to do so, right? And this is all part of the MAS project where we are trying to put together enough data to form a platform that is truly effective for green financing. So we started to hear a lot of interesting requirements, which is really great, right? Because we talk about Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and that's exactly what it seems like these requirements are all about. To really go into the supply chain, to really look at the provenance of the material being used, to really look at the certifications of the supplier, for example, and the practices that the upstream farmer or supplier has gone through. So I think that's really interesting and important, and it also sets us apart, I would say, because Singapore is really a hub, right? Where nothing is really only built in Singapore or made in Singapore. Everything comes from somewhere else, okay? And so that's this supply chain that we always cannot ignore. Now, similarly, as we do well here, we could also possibly, Singapore is always about talking about the internationalization of carbon credits, for example, which I personally agree with because, carbon in the atmosphere is global, particularly for Singapore as a small little state, right? We are affected and we are impacting other people too, okay? So that's where I think with all these multiple tiers of supply chain tracking, with all this internationalization of cross-sector requirements for what we are supposed to track, I think that's an interesting development that will set us up well.
If I can answer your question in 2 ways. One, I absolutely see happening, and one, what I hope to see will happen.
Absolutely.
Right? What is happening? there'll be more and more banks that will tell you what we can and cannot do, what we will and won't do. Just, whether it's, right thing or wrong thing, it's always up for debate. But in my mind, it is the right thing. Finance emissions, we're all setting targets for ourselves where we need to get to by 2030 as a first instance. Whether we cap it right where we are right now as of our last financial year end and drive it down. And we've got a lot of customers. Again, the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 becomes extremely important, right? But certainly fossil fuels, things like coal, how do we run it down without impacting in the worst possible way communities that need access to cheap power for their own economic development, right? And because if you want somebody to say, hey, let's move to green energy, I mean, we live in an island where, as a city-state, all these lights, the air conditioning, is all coming from LNG right now. It's the lowest form of fossil fuel in terms of carbon intensity, but there's no alternative. We've lined this whole thing with solar panels, and it still won't be enough, right? We've set a target as a country to move 30% renewable, and we have to buy this in. We will deploy capital. We'll make everything possible. We'll even fund an ASEAN power grid if we have to make it possible. But we need partners to come on this journey with us because we simply don't have enough land space, right, to make solar a reality for us. There's no hydro. The Kallang River ain't strong enough, right? Let's face it. Wind, access to water, right, to capture wind. I mean, we just could be honest with ourselves and how we negotiate this with all our partners. I think that's going to be key. But the big thing is, as banks, and we're not going to be alone, it's going to be a shift in the entire industry. So anybody in coal, please beware, right? And there'll be repercussions across industries and potentially communities. And we need to find just and urgent energy transition. We need to come up with programs that people get behind and do all the right things for the right outcomes. Yeah. What I hope to see, right now, I'll be blunt, banks are taking the brunt of a lot of things, including saying, please take a green loan, let's do the right things, let's set the right sustainable performance targets, and then if you hit it, we give you, the customer, a discount. Nobody else wants to take a discount. Not the investors. They say, hey, I'm giving you my capital. Here's my rate of return. Non-negotiable. Management teams get fired if we don't deliver for our shareholders, right? And what have you. But we all got to come into this together. It is a journey for all of us in the long term. And I'm going to sound a little bit naive here, right? But it is one of the situations. What are we all individually willing to do, right, to make this possible? It can't be just one party or stakeholder in the entire economy, right, in the ecosystem.
Thanks. So before I let Jonas answer that, I would like to jump in there for a second because I think it's thinking about banks as the conduit for change. I think we all need to take action as well, right? And I've been thinking about this from the perspective of, so I'm a finance professor by training. So I've been thinking about this from the perspective of green bonds and how green bonds actually are not always priced lower, meaning the coupons are about the same as the regular bonds, which means that bond investors don't take a cut. And then we turn around and tell banks to take 10 basis point cut, which is a lot of money from the bank's perspective, right? So I think this is something that and banks to some extent may be willing to do that if we actually have impact. And that's the issue. That's the other issue that we are facing here, which is that we don't know whether or not these 10 basis points that the bank is offering to the borrowers actually translate into impact and outcome. And that's something I think green fintech startups can actually think about. How do you measure impact better so that banks can actually feel better about making this sacrifice, and then hopefully other investors will be willing to make the sacrifice as well because they can see the impact and the outcome. Sorry, Jonas, to cut you off, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something I would agree on. I think there's still so much to be extracted from data that is these days basically in pillars and cannot really be shared. I think that's something we discussed also prior to this meeting. So I think in terms of, I would probably focus now more on on macro trends, and something that also opened my eye was actually I watched Benjamin's presentation regarding SMEs now being able to basically submit their own information regarding how sustainable they are. So what we are definitely going to see is we are going to see more or less every organization that will be basically disclosing and needs to take climate considerations into account. I think that's a big trend that will create a lot more data, a lot more transparency, hopefully, traceability, which again will be something that startups can then tackle in terms of making sense out of all of this. I would still see increasing regulation to come down the line. David mentioned it. We don't really know yet how we actually achieve these goals. So I think the regulators, the governments will have to come up with plans. So I think that's going to be a big topic. In terms of VC funding rounds that we are seeing, of course, the majority right now has been in pre-seed, seed, Series A, because we are early in this space. What we will be seeing is we will see more investments going into climate fintechs. Actually, the 13 startups in Singapore, they raised together 100 million Singapore dollars overall. So you can see this is an early play. But as we all know, they will go on to raise a Series B, a Series C. And eventually what will happen is M&A activity and consolidation, right? So maybe SMBC will be interested to buy up a startup coming down the line. And that's for sure going to happen. We have already seen a number of such acquisitions, like JP Morgan last year acquired Open Invest, ESG provider, investment management solution. So there are a number of those that are happening. And again, also as we've seen, we have now 13 startups in Singapore, and that region, especially the developing emerging markets, have still a lot to catch up, but I'm sure they will catch up. And we will see a lot more startups coming out of emerging markets. That's what I would say.
I think that's crucial, right? I think regulations will give rise to more demand for technology, because and if you're in the banking sector, clearly you're familiar with the fact that whenever there's a new regulation, suddenly you need a lot more technology to keep up with it. And what I've seen here in this space is that it's not just regulation that's creating demand for this, but also I think consumers can also take action and investors. And to some extent, for this to happen, again, we need measurement, we need traceability, we need ways to capture the impact of the actions that each entity is making. So I'm a bit intrigued with this idea of looking at SMEs, and to some extent, how much do you think there is scope for the fintech startups to serve the SME sector? I don't know which one of you would like to take that question, but I see this as being very promising, but at the same time very difficult. So maybe Ben can start.
Yeah,
this.
maybe I can go first. So I do think that this is an important, thing to do, to really serve the SMEs, because they still serve or form the backbone of our economy. When I say our economy, I should talk about Southeast Asia in general, not just Singapore, right? So Southeast Asia's economy is still majority, more than 50%, driven by the SMEs. And so we do need a way to serve these masses. Even in Singapore, there's only a few hundred listed companies, but there's hundreds and thousands of SMEs, right? So is there a way that we could feed them a playbook, if you may, right? An easy way that they could now get on board sustainability. It has to be, of course, validated. It has to conform to financial industry standards. Okay, and I think that's the entire exercise of the MES project anyway. To set a high standard, but of course conform to the nuances of SMEs specific to particular industries, so that the companies have an easier way or understand how to get on board. And with that, right, I think that also serves a way to have engagement. Because I do agree with you, Prof, when you talk about, impact, and also to David's point about getting more than just the banks involved. So engagement is important, right? It's not just banks picking up the tab. How about consumers? And by extension, how about these SMEs or merchants? What if they are actually being able, to be able to share their data and get incentivized or punished, by the consumers if they are not doing good? Right? So these are the various things that we need to start thinking about, and it's only when we have this type of engagement or awards and incentives on a more wider scale, that's where the impact could really be felt. And this is something that I feel has to be provided by technology, be it ours or the ecosystem of technology partners that we're working with. It is only possible when there is technology to bring this to scale.
Yeah, I would fully agree, and I think topics again that we would be looking in that space is, for example, supply chain finance, right? That you can link it then with environmental contributions of these SMEs. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Lending, I think SMEs in Southeast Asia are very much struggling to get credit, and I think in here again, whether it's sustainable, like climate fintech, environmental startups that are raising funds or needing credit, or in general SMEs, I think there's a lot to be done.
If I may add, the element around SMEs, it's a very local bank play. SMBC, we've got SMEs in Japan covered. Will I do SME here in Singapore or Indonesia? Why would I, right? I would respect what DBS, UOB, and OCBC will bring to the table, look after the SMEs. We could provide services. We could be part of the platform for Pay Now, and form the background, like a backbone, if you will, in terms of the transmission of money, sharing credit, as we would, scores. But will we be the ones lending in local currency? Just like I wouldn't expect, ICICI Bank to come to Japan and bank Japanese SMEs, It's just one of those things. So then, something that Ben touched on, partnership is going to be absolutely key. How do we find, when we look at the ecosystem, if we understand from one SME to the next, what is it they do, right? What do they buy from? Where do they sell to? Especially if it's an international business, because SMEs do international trade as well. How can we help bring a greater resilience to their business? Then I think we all come out better. And that partnership then, whether we come from a Japanese angle and we work with the banks in Hong Kong for Hong Kong, work with banks in Singapore for Singapore, and so on and so forth. I think that would be then very, very powerful. And again, in that regard, I think technology could have a real play in that.
So thanks for that, because I would like to touch on one word you used there, which is resilience. So resilience, I think here has two meanings. One is resilience to climate change, and also resilience to regulation change. And so I'm wondering, I think in a lot of this space, we call it green tech, but some of it is also reg tech, right? Some of this actually allows companies to be able to be more resilient to changes in regulations, particularly with respect to the environment. And do you see a scope for this type of startups in this space to combine reg tech and fintech to some extent, and green tech to some extent?
Yeah, I mean.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think reg tech has a lot of potential, because one issue is that if regulation continues to be a burden on these companies, right, profitability goes down. And for some smaller players, it gets almost unprofitable to actually do that business, because you basically need to hire dozens of people just to do compliance. I mean, that's even a problem for the large financial institutions. Hence, we need really automation here, and I think RegTechs have a very important role to play to fully automate such processes, make it much more streamlined, and frankly reduce compliance costs, because it's just unbearable. So huge potential.
Yes, David?
Yeah, I think there are two things to this, right? In every country in the world, there are lots of regulations. The key thing is enforcement. How do you monitor and then enforce? There are a lot of these things. My take would be, from where financial industry come in, we're almost at the back end of stuff, right? What needs to happen is, especially, and this again, sorry if I sound a little bit naive, but to really bring about change at the sort of climate change and sustainability perspective, it's behaviors. If for me, and the locals here know of hawker center called Chom Chom. Up until maybe even 6 months ago, I hated eating there, because they'll give you your food in a styrofoam plate, and then you eat with plastic forks and knives and spoons, and you sort of think, wow, you know, we were in 2021 but at that point in time, and you're still doing this. And then they got shut down. They were like 3 months, big refurbishment during the lockdown. And now you go again and actually use proper utensils that are, you know, to be washed and reused, which is the right move. Now, I've also seen the truck that you know, last year were delivering the styrofoam plates, delivering the plastic spoons and forks and knives. That business has got to be dead. If it's not already dead, it should be dying, right? Now, any bank supporting the SME, because it would have been an SME, right? I hope they've managed to pivot to something else. I do not wish the family any ill will, right? I hope they've managed to pivot to something better and more sustainable, and no pun intended, right? But it's fundamental, right? When you start charging Singaporeans 20 cents for a plastic bag, every time you go to NTUC, things will change. But we need that to happen, and then we react. Because we can't go to NTUC and say, you start charging everybody 20 cents now, or else we don't fund you. It ain't gonna happen. You see what I mean? Yeah. So it's a different thing that needs to come in, and then we will back it up. I hope that makes sense.
Makes sense. And I think behavioral change is very important. And anything that the government can do as well as the private sector can do to make that happen, I think is crucial. Ben, you have something in your mind?
I totally second David's points here because, you know, we are starting to see the demand on the corporate side too. And usually this is because of their buyer or their customers, right? So, you know, some as traditional as you can imagine, literally drivers, right? They are operating fleets of vehicles. They are getting asked by their clients, who may be an MNC, because these MNCs usually outsource their driving fleet here. You know, they are being asked by the client to show them some report about the sustainability activities. So these are not really regulations, if you may, but these are actually behaving like regulations. And that's something that's crucial here, you know, to be able to change this behavior in the society. Okay, so much to the extent that many of these companies are now trying to be sustainable. They might not know the, you know, the technical terms of ESG, but they are really starting to behave, you know, in a more sustainable fashion. And that's something that's really promising because it's really driving change at the bottom grassroots stage. Yeah.
Please call that company or call me. I'll help them electrify their fleet. Underwrite.
Excellent. So business opportunities coming up here on the panel. So I would like to open the floor. If there's any questions from the audience, burning questions that you would like to ask the panel, please feel free to raise your hand. I still have questions, but I would like to open the floor. If there's anything. This is the second where in my class I will count to 10. If there is no question from the audience, then I will ask the audience. Please, I don't have to count.
Singapore's port is famous everywhere in the world. What about the maritime industry? How far is it going in this direction of green?
Thank you. So I think we've talked about shipping a little bit. We touched on shipping, but I would like to hear more if any of you have specific thoughts on the maritime industry.
No, thank you. If you don't mind, I'll have a crack at this. I think the maritime industry has been going through a major shift already for quite a number of years. First thing, the desulfurization of their fuels, right? Now there are many that are talking about how can potentially use methane, use hydrogen. There are so many LNG vessels that already use LNG, the cargo they're transporting to help power the engine. Number of ships that we are now financing as well, the new generation, which has a lot of solar panels across every possible surface of the ship. A lot of these things are improving in the way that the ships are built, you know, using as many recycled parts as possible. So a lot of those things that the shipping companies themselves have been working on. The most impactful one, though, I suspect, was actually just brought forth by the Japanese government. Because you imagine, you know, from Japan, still the third largest economy in the world, very big players in the maritime industry. They are talking about introducing a global carbon tax that could be applied across the world. If you're running a container ship, you're up for it. Break bulk, you're up for it. You know, anything in transportation. So, not surprisingly, not every country is falling over themselves to sign up to this just yet, but it is at least being debated. And it will be brought to various associations and councils and governments ultimately, just as the US government managed to introduce new rules around standardization of a minimum level of corporate tax. I think these things will come. And I think they're vitally important to drive the right behaviors, you know, fundamentally, because it changes the economics of this tremendously. If you run a less carbon-intensive ship, how you price that becomes extremely important. And again, then the whole monitoring and, you know, you have a rule, you apply a tax rate, how do you enforce it and then collect the tax is going to be important.
Thanks, David. Ben?
I think this is where I come in. Because actually we have already started working with many tech startups. Some of them are not really startups anymore. Some of them are really huge. And they are providing technologies in the tracking of the shipping sector. So you might be interested to know that the MPA, the Maritime Port Authority of Singapore, they have already published their decarbonization blueprint in March this year. So this decarbonization blueprint is very well thought through 7 focus areas, of which, you know, some of them is where, you know, financing could take a role. But of course, these are really getting down to decarbonization. One thing that I was really impressed about the blueprint was the emphasis on decarbonization rather than offsetting. You know, it is really committed in decarbonizing. And also, I just want to point out that just behind you is the Pier 71. You know, that's where you have a lot of interesting technology solutions that I just saw in the maritime sector, hosted in conjunction with the NUS. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. I was also going to point out to the booth right there, because if you just walk around behind you, although time is probably running out, if you just walk around behind you, you'll see there's a lot of development in the maritime sector, and a lot of these developments are centered on, you know, tracking better and also potentially reducing carbon. And I've seen some moonshot projects now that are being talked about, thinking about electric vehicles, but on the literally electric ships. And the issue is infrastructure. Infrastructure development will be quite challenging, because if you think about battery swapping in Singapore, think about battery swapping in the middle of the sea, right? But these are projects that are going. People are thinking about it, and I think there may be space for startups in this space as well.
Yeah. Okay. And please call it in anytime you ever see a non-electric forklift. We've got to change that to the most fundamental level.
Yeah.
Seriously.
There are a lot of things that can be done in the sector, and I think Singapore is doing quite a bit. And I think the FinTech sector can also help as well. Jonas, any thought on this, or it's no?
No, I think I'm not. I'm honestly not a maritime expert.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, yes, here in the front.
Hello. Okay, so I have a question. This green fintechs right now, we're seeing that they're mostly focusing on the businesses, SMEs, things like that. People, I mean, focusing on companies to make an impact. But what I want to know is, you know, how do consumers actually play a bigger role in this green movement, and especially, you know, these green fintechs, how can they support consumers or encourage consumerism to, you know, drive towards the green direction, because it's always focused on the bigger players. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So just a couple of use cases and startups that I can mention. For example, there is Doconomy. Doconomy is a unicorn based out of Sweden. And they really basically measure the carbon footprint of whatever you're consuming. So they would partner, for example, with MasterCard. And whatever you buy, they basically give that a score in terms of how much carbon this has, basically to produce this product, how much carbon that was. And it gives you a really very transparent view of how your spending impacts basically your impact in terms of carbon specifically. And they also work with financial institutions, providing you data feeds that really give you a much better visual understanding of your impact in terms of carbon. There are also neobanks that focus on climate fintech. So in France, there is a startup called Green Got. It's a neobank, and they basically they invest all your savings into ESG funds according to your risk appetite, and also in terms of what is for you acceptable in terms of ESG, what are your priorities. So there are these niche players that will provide you services that really serve you specifically on climate fintech. And I think there's still a lot to be done, but that's the direction that it is going in terms of consumers and what you can basically, how you can take part of this by visualizing your consumption, etc. I think that's where it's going.
I think for me, it's about consumer behavior. It really starts if you go to Switzerland, the amount of things get recycled by the people.
May I have your attention, please? Sorry. The calls will be closing in 25 minutes.
Yeah.
No pressure. No pressure.
I think it's a pity for a city-state like ours to not be recycling more. I think that makes a big change in a lot of things. And it could be even white goods, right? If you don't want to handle the day-to-day garbage. But a lot of these things, from large white goods in particular to plastics, I think we could do a lot. And if we do that, the technology will follow. And then the banks will definitely support those things. The one thing which I found very encouraging is food waste. This is the other thing. It's a real global issue, the amount of food we waste. There are technologies that are able to measure the amount of food that's wasted by people. And actually one of the world's largest food catering services of European origin, they actually have a sustainability linked loan. And one part of their sustainability performance targets is about reducing food waste. Because so many cafeterias that they serve globally, right? You put the food out there as a buffet. How do you try to understand your customers better? How are the customers themselves more sensitive to the fact that there's so much food being wasted? Then how do we deploy technology to measure that so that we can incentivize the company and everybody involved to waste less food? This world needs to have no hunger.
And yeah, just to echo on the above points, right? So, the question was about, these technologies serving only to large corps, but actually these large companies also can play a role in driving the consumer behavior. We talk about transparency and impact, right? So that's where this impact being shown to the consumers, being transparent to the consumers, can actually help to sway the consumer behavior. So one of the use cases that we have started to get involved with is with a very large company with a huge e-commerce footprint, right? They are now able, at least to a certain scale, not everything yet, but to a certain scale, able to show some of these products that they sell and the corresponding impact in terms of environmental impact of their products, right? And that is a small step in just educating consumers, what they are doing when they are, what's their impact when they are purchasing these products as opposed to something else, right? So I think these are very simple things that technology can enable. Of course, in a wider scale, hopefully we can scale that up to be able to really have product level tracking to make it transparent for consumers to really make informed decisions. Kind of like, because I'm trying to lose weight now, right? When I'm trying to eat everything, I'm looking at the calorie number. It's kind of like that, right? I hope this happens in the near-term future.
So I think technology that can be used to inform consumers will be very useful. Now, of course, nobody is building technology for free, right? So I think the point is that if you have that technology, the technology can also be used in a B2B setting, right? Potentially to incentivize consumers to do even better, or incentivize companies to do better in terms of making sure that consumers understand what they're consuming and what is the impact of their consumption. Right, so I think that's a very important question and something that clearly my institute has been heavily promoting this individual scorecard. And the idea is that every individual should have a scorecard, maybe even tattooed in their head in terms of how well they're doing, right? And that's probably something that sounds biblical, but it's something that I think is crucial to keep in mind, that everybody should play their role. Everybody has their role to play in reducing our impact on the planet. Okay, so we have about a minute left. So if you have a burning question, I was going to say, you get to ask the last question then.
Hi. So basically, any movement towards sustainability almost always is at the cost of initial profits, right? And so, do you think that government necessarily have to, step up and basically promote sustainability, or is there a way we can change that? So, companies don't necessarily lose out on profits at the very beginning when they're trying to make a move towards sustainability, trying to go green. So, is there a way we can do that, or is it necessary that the government puts in some policies to make that happen? What do you think?
I think it has already started, right? So with the carbon tax, as just one example, okay, the opportunity cost of going green wasn't that high before, the cost, but now the opportunity cost is much higher because you would otherwise have to pay this carbon tax. So that's just one example of many initiatives that the government has come up with. And I personally think that, with government regulations and the consumer behavior and buyer behavior, and I'll talk about buyers in both large and small terms, right? Large buyers are forcing their suppliers, to be sustainable and report their footprint. And I think that's where it creates a new normal. If you ask me, in the near future, I'm not talking about 20 or 30 years, but I'm talking about within 10 years, right? Between the next 5 to 10 years, it will become a normal that, sustainable companies are profitable. And to be profitable, you have to be sustainable. Yeah.
I think that's a really good question, right? I don't think it's one or the other. I'm a very big fan of a company called PepsiCo. They almost changed their entire product pipeline, apart from the actual cola itself. But everything they do, from all the inputs to raw materials, that last mile delivery, but everything within the value chain of Pepsi. Please, read it up for yourself. It's probably one of the most sustainable companies in the world, and it's still wildly profitable. I think that, as Ben alluded to, there are more and more case studies out there for many companies across various industries. You don't have to choose. Becoming more sustainable doesn't mean you are any less profitable.
And our ability to actually keep track of how sustainable a company is will also play a role here, because then consumers can see which companies are actually more sustainable, and that may impact the company's bottom line. Right? So profitability here, at the end of the day, profitability will be affected, but it may be affected positively. Right? So I hope that's a positive message to end on this panel. So thank you so much for being here at the end of the day. I would like to thank the panelists here for sharing, their insights. It's a very interesting topic, but I think, you've made it even more interesting, at least for me. I'm not sure about the audience. The audience seems a bit sleepy. So sleepy high. Maybe we can give a round of applause to our panelists here. All right, thank you so much.